at Villanova, so sort of like a Muslim chaplain on campus, and then also an interfaith advisor at Bryn Mawr College and at Swarthmore College. So all these roles are sort of similar. They're sort of volunteer / very part-time roles in interfaith or with Muslim students on campus. And then I'm also a director at Interfaith Philadelphia. So that's my day staff benefits paying job. So the reason Todd mentioned that I haven't done this is because when I've asked students, like, so what would you like to do this year for Muslim life on campus? Like, would you like to do a tech study on Thursday nights or something? And I get like a quiet no response. So I'm like, okay, I guess that's not something that's going to be interesting to folks. We've focused on activities and social service things, so whatever is important to them. But so I haven't had a chance, even though I've studied it, the text myself, I haven't had a chance to sort of present, lead, co-lead something. So this will be a good experience, I think, for all of us. And so today's program is going to be more about some of the background to the text. The setting of where it comes, what was it like, what are some of the important scriptures in the Islamic tradition, how do people understand them, and then we will get into a little bit of text. Both the first chapter we'll briefly talk about, and we'll go more in depth in the future, and also the first piece of Revelation, and so we'll talk about a little bit about that. So that's today. So it'll be mostly set up, and then hopefully it'll leave you with a cliffhanger at the end. So setting, meaning context, I think for you guys appreciate that context is important to understanding any text, but particularly sacred text, scriptural text. I think we all believe and understand that sacred text was revealed, understood, came about at a particular time and place, but that it is also meant for humanity for all time and all place. So how do we sort of balance those things? And that's the balance of interpretation. And I think all traditions struggle. And that's part of the struggle, is to figure out how do you make something that was revealed a long time ago, in a place that didn't have cell phones or cars, make it relevant for us today. So what was the setting? So it says here up top, Arabia 570. 570 of the Common Era, AD. So that is when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he was born. The revelations didn't start till he was about 40 years old, so that's 610 of the Common Era. But this kind of gives you a rough idea of what was the lay of the land. So at that time, the Byzantines were in Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Empire, and that, as you probably know, was through Asia Minor, into the Levant, into Damascus and places like that. A Zoroastrian Persian Empire was dominating these mountain plateau areas. And the Arabian Peninsula was sort of kind of a backwater. It had trade routes that went through it. So you see sea trade routes, land trade routes that go through there, and that's Mecca. And so it's important to see that it is on this trade route between Yemen and Damascus. And this area, the central coastal part of Arabia, was a trade center. And for trade for spices, for goods. Yemen was a very fertile area, so was Syria, and routes traveled through there. Also, Abyssinia, Ethiopia, Yemen, these places are very connected culturally, trade, linguistically, sometimes politically. The borders go back and forth across those waters. So to give you a little bit of idea, there's major powers in the area, and there's sort of like a backwater vacuum in the area, in the middle here. It's always, this is sort of the academic part of it, but it's easier to understand these things in in video. Video does a good job, but sometimes it portrays something in different ways, right? So what I'm trying to say is Charlton Heston isn't Moses, but that's what we think of as Moses, right? Because we've seen him so many times. Every Easter, he shows up as Moses. And so the movie clip I'm going to show you, first of all, I'll play the beginning of the clip, and it really explains the movie. So this is a movie called The Message. It was made in the mid-'70s. It is sort of the parallel of the Ten Commandments in the Islamic tradition. It's called The Message. It's one of those epic, classic type of movie type of thing. So I'll pause a couple times here. So we can read the scholars and historians of Islam at the University of Al-Azhar, that's this main Sunni institution, and the High Islamic Congress of Shia in Lebanon at the time. So this is in the mid-'70s. These scholars were advisors and signing off on the content of it. So basically they're saying we had Sunni and Shia scholars who watched this movie, read the screenplay, and were comfortable with it. There it says, the makers of the movie honor the Islamic tradition, which holds that the impersonation of the Prophet offends against the spirituality of his message. Therefore, the person of Muhammad will not be shown. So we're going to have a movie without the title characters. And the way they do this, if you hear this mystical music that's playing, anytime Muhammad is in the scene, they play this music to let you know that like people are talking to him. So I'll play like about 2 more minutes, and this is sort of the setting again. It'll talk a little bit about what was that part of the world in 570, in 610, around that time.
600 years after Christ died, when Europe was sunk in the Dark Ages and everywhere the old civilizations were falling, Muhammad was born in Mecca, in Arabia. Mecca was then a rich trading city, ruled by its merchants, whose wealth was multiplied by a unique privilege. They housed the gods. Every year, at the time of the great fair, the desert priests brought their idols and the images of their gods into the custody of the Kaaba. Once the most holy shrine of Abraham, the Kaaba had now become a house of idolatry, boasting no fewer than 360 different gods. Mecca, in 610 AD.
So that gives you a little bit of a background. So, yep, go ahead.
Most holy site of Abraham.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So the Islamic understanding is that this city, Mecca, which was not a city at the time, was founded by Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael. Ishmael is a baby. So the story that's dictated in the Quran is that Ishmael is born to Hagar. That's the only child at that time. There's a lot of parallels to the story that you know, but there's some differences. And in here is there's not strife, or there's not a conflict here between Sarah and Hagar. And God has instructed at some point to Abraham to take his wife, and Hagar is a wife, to take Hagar and Ishmael and travel. And so the three of them travel, and they end up in what is today Mecca, at that time nothing but empty desert. And the story that's in the Quran is he sort of drops them off and starts heading out. And Hagar is like, husband, what's going on here? And he keeps walking, and it's like, Abraham, like, what are you doing? And he keeps walking, and then she says, did God command you to leave us here? And he sort of acknowledges that's what's happening. And she's like, okay, I accept it. So in the Islamic tradition, it's a huge point of the depth of her faith, the depth of her trust in God and God's plan to leave her and her infant in the desert, and to be sort of okay with it, basically. Abraham leaves, and it's a desert, so she's looking for water, and she runs back and forth looking for water, doing whatever she can. And eventually, the baby Ishmael, he sort of kicks the sand, and water springs forth. And that spot exists to this day. There's a spring there called Zamzam water, which Muslims find to be holy water. When people go overseas now, they want to bring back bottles and things like that. And so later on, as Ishmael grows up, Ishmael and his mother and then other people sort of come by, find out that, oh, you have water, can we partake in it? But it's sort of her water, or their water, the two of them. And so she has a lot of agency to say, okay, you can camp here based on these stipulations, and she has sort of agency in sort of the development of that community. And eventually, Abraham comes back to visit, and at that time, Ishmael is older. These dates aren't specific. And Ishmael and Abraham build the Kaaba. They build a simple cubic shrine altar to God. There's nothing in it. It's just a very simple cubic block. And so that is known as what is being referred to here as this original monotheistic worship place. And then over time, over many generations, it's sort of, that community falls apart. They fall into idolatry and polytheism. And by the time Muhammad is born, the place is like full of trinkets and idols and things like that. So they've very fallen away. So it happens over a long period of time, the story of Moses, he goes away for 4 days and they fall into idolatry. It happens over a long period of time. But it's a similar message. Like, you were given guidance, you were given a prophet, you were given all that you needed to have for life, and you fell away from it. There is a prayer that's in the Quran that Muslims understand to be the prayer that was answered by the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran. So there's a prayer that Abraham and Ishmael make when they're building this, that they wish for people who are given guidance, who are given their own prophet. And so those details are seen to come to fruition in the name of Muhammad and the guidance of the Quran. Any other questions? Yeah?
What was the state of Judaism at the time in Mecca?
So there were Jews There were Jews in Medina. There were a couple tribes of Jewish folks in Medina. Mecca, I don't know. Possibly. Much smaller presence. Medina was a little bit stronger presence. There was also some scattered communities of Jews in Yemen. So there were Jewish tribes that were there. So in Medina, there was 2 tribes that were sort of living next to a couple pagan tribes, if we would use that terminology, regular Arab tribes. I don't know about Mecca, and I think there were some in Yemen. There were also some Christian monks that lived around here, and they figure in this Islamic story too. Their understanding of Christianity, or I shouldn't say, they're Christians, but they are also looking out for a new prophet to come. So I don't know how that fits or doesn't fit with the way you would understand Christianity, but there's 2 prominent Christians that figure in the story. One is the sort of uncle-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. So Prophet Muhammad's wife, Khadija, her uncle is a Christian, who is sort of on the lookout that somebody special might be coming to our land, or coming out of our land. A teacher, a prophet, they're sort of waiting for somebody. And then after he is born and he's sort of a young boy, they're traveling someplace, and then there's this other Christian monk who sees him and sort of says that, tells his sort of guardians, like, there are going to be people that are going to come after him. So just so you guys know, that's what happens to people who try to preach. So be on the lookout for danger for your son here.
And just so folks know, and we talked a little bit about this in the heresy conversations, that the Christians that would have been in this area are probably descendants of sort of the Ebionistic crowd, Monophysite crowds. So they're different than how we would view Orthodox Christians at this point. So if they are Ebionists, and recall that the Ebionist sees Christ as more of a human figure who is adopted by God. So it stands to reason that there could be additional human figures adopted by God, of which, from that Christian perspective, Muhammad could be that kind of figure.
And then there's an additional type of person that is spiritual person that's living here, which in the Arabic context are called Hanifs. And these are sort of, maybe I don't know, I'll say it. They're sort of like the classical spiritual but not religious sort of folks. They're people who are monotheistic. They believe in a high being. They don't agree with the idolatry they see in their society. But they're not necessarily Christian or Jewish. They're sort of independent monotheists. So that's why I was using sort of classical spiritual but not religious. So these are some of the types of people that are inhabiting this area. The power structure is dominated by the polytheistic folks here. They're the majority of the population, they run the major institutions. And as the movie implied, Mecca is a trading center, but it's also this pilgrimage center, and they make a lot of money out of pilgrimage. And so over time, they basically said, oh, you have a God, bring it over. More traffic for our business, right? And so that's sort of the state of the condition. Any other questions that come up? Okay. So that's sort of the lay of the land when the Prophet Muhammad is is born and he's growing up and he's living in this society. So that's sort of a little bit of the background. Now we'll sort of go back to the actual text here. So the Quran starts getting revealed in 610 of the Common Era. This is when he's about 40 years old. The Islamic understanding is the Quran has always existed. It's God's speech. And that it's also sort of preserved or written in some sort of way. It's called the preserved tablet in heaven. What that physically constitutes, I don't know. And that Gabriel is sort of given knowledge of that, and then Gabriel then passes it on to the Prophet Muhammad, and the Prophet Muhammad then passes it on to humanity at large. It's not done in one session. It's done over about 23 years, piece by piece, from 610 to about 632. And then it's completed early in 632. And that's sort of codified. As it is revealed, piece by piece, it's sort of revealed for the time and place. So if there's something happening with the Muslim community or the nascent community at the time, a verse is revealed that is sort of contextually relevant to that place and time. And some of that has been preserved, like when exactly it was revealed. Sometimes there's a general idea of roughly when and where it was revealed. So those are sort of context markers that help people understand at least the original implementation of it. The Quran was not revealed in the order that we have it today. It was revealed, let's say, a couple verses from chapter 2, or what became chapter 2, a couple verses maybe from what became chapter 96, and things like that. And it was all set in order in the final year, in 632, but this is the final official order.
And how was it revealed?
So it was revealed in... So the prophet shares what it feels like to receive revelation. So sometimes it's just implanted in his mind. Sometimes it's a physical ordeal, like there's pain, there's difficulty that goes with interacting with Gabriel, an awe-inspiring being. We'll show a little clip from the same movie about the first instance of revelation. But the revelations are sort of outer worldly, mystical, and then within either hours or days, he then shares it with first his wife, family, companions, folks like that. Eventually, the Quran is, like I said, near the end of his life, organized into surahs. So surahs is sort of like chapters, and that's how we sort of effectively use it today. There's 114 of them. And it comes through in 6,200 verses. Verses is a translation of the word ayah. Ayah literally means a sign of God. So each one is a sign of God. The style of the text it's not prose, it's not chronological, it's not like the story of Genesis and then Noah and then Abraham. It's not like that. All these, everything I just mentioned is in the Quran, but it is in different places. And it's not prose, it's not poetry, but there's a meter, there's a rhyme scheme to it. And I think that's one of the major reasons why people are able to remember it so well. So every single community, if you go to the two communities that I mentioned, AIS, which stands for, I think, Al-Salam, Islamic Society, and then MLMS is the Muslim Society of the Main Line. I'm on the board of MOMS, just so you know. And there's almost always, if your community is big enough, there will be somebody that knows the entire text by heart. All 6,200 verses by heart. And additionally, they are taught, when somebody is taking on that task, you are taught a certain intonation. So there's a way to recite it that, I went to this retreat over the summer. I had been reciting chapter 1 all my life, and I got a ton of corrections. Of like, no, elongate that, use this part of the throat to enunciate it. So it was a lot of like fine tuning of like exactly how to pronounce those words and recite them. So while it sounds like singing, Muslims would never say the Quran is sung. The English translation is the recitation of the Quran. People also read it in the morning or whenever they might read it. And it was codified in the life of the Prophet. So I mentioned a couple times that all these verses came down, and it was codified primarily orally. There were hundreds of people who knew the entire Quran by heart. That was the number one way it was remembered. And it is still a primary way that it is remembered and understood. But it was also written down before he passed away. Now it was written down, but it didn't look like this. There was no book that was kind of codified at the end of his life. It was written down on parchment, on animal skin, on bone, on all various ways. But the actual sort of book form took about a dozen years or so before it became in that form.
Are any of those early fragments extant, the pre-book form?
So, I don't know, there might be some pieces here and there of that. The really earliest ones go back to the mid 600s, which is pretty close. The Prophet passed away in 632. There are Quran manuscripts, books, that have been carbon dated to about the mid 600s. So that's relatively recent. There was one found in Yemen. It got taken to Birmingham, England. It sat on a shelf for a long time, for like 70 years, and then somebody found it, and then somebody carbon dated it, and they're like, oh my God, 650, or mid 600s,
About how many people were literate at that time?
So, the vast majority are not literate.
Right.
And that's why the oral tradition is so strong. In pre-modern society, oral tradition is incredibly strong. And he did have scribes, and so those are the folks who wrote it down. And the scribes trained other scribes, and as they spread the message, there was a scribe to go along with it, so be able to pass that way. But yeah, I don't know the percentage. It was
I don't
definitely
care about the percentage. Majority were not
the
literate.
majority definitely were, not literate. But people were very much steeped in poetry. And so again, something that had a rhyme scheme was very easy for them to remember. Sometimes, I have the last, 4 or 5 pages memorized. That's about it. Out of about 600 pages. So, but sometimes it is an accomplishment, definitely, to memorize the entire text. But it's not sort of the impossible task, right? That's why I said there's probably a couple hundred people in southeastern Pennsylvania that have that done. It takes some diligence and time, but we all have lots of words memorized. How many song lyrics do you know by heart? Right? And a lot, right? And so if you hear it enough times, and that's part of the other thing, in Muslim majority societies, people are going to be hearing this morning, noon, and night. It's going to be in the air. A grandparent reciting it, walking by a mosque hearing a recitation. It's in the air, and so you pick it up. And that's not the case here. Here, you really have to work for it, because That's the only time you listen to it. Any other questions about like sort of what the basics of the Quran here? So the other important text I wanted to share, because I'll refer to it over our conversation, is Hadith. Hadith means sort of news, reports, and in this case, it means reports of the Prophet Muhammad. And those are what's called sunnah. Sunnah means traditions or practices. When it's a capital S in the Islamic tradition, that generally means the sunnah of the practices and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. Things he did, things like that. So while I've sort of mentioned that the Quran is codified in his life, and there's no disagreement among Muslims across the world as to the text of the Quran. You can pick up the Arabic Quran in Malaysia, Indonesia, Senegal, Iraq, Exton, wherever. It's the exact same, to the letter. There's no disagreement. Sunni, Shia, Sufi, Salafi, whatever it is. Arabic text is identical. So that's a great blessing. Interpretation, there's 2 billion people, there's 2 billion interpretations. But when it comes to Hadith, there's much more differences. So the Hadith, these practices of the Prophet Muhammad, they're collected, and again, they're orally transmitted, but then they start getting collected about 100 to 300 years after he passes away. So there's a longer time lag here, right? And they get collected. So they get collected 100, 300 years later, and there are 6 widely accepted collections in the Sunni collections, and there's about, I think, 4 in the Shia collections, and they're different. They have different sources, but they use a similar methodology. There's a very detailed practice of like, I heard this report from so-and-so heard it from this person heard it from this person, going back to the Prophet Muhammad. And there's all these and there's biographies that were developed early on of these people, who were these narrators of these stories. And the biographies were about when they lived, where they lived. So if you get something, a story that says so-and-so talked to so-and-so, and you're like, wait a second, you guys weren't alive at the same time. Or you were living in Morocco, you were living in Iraq, when did you travel? So there's lots of things like that come up that they can say oh, these people lived at a similar place, similar time, they could have met, it's possible. You don't have obviously documentation that they did, but it sort of makes sense that they could have. And there's sort of character references. So I remember one of my teachers sharing, reading an excerpt of these character references, and so this person was very pious, they always prayed, they always gave charity, blah, blah, blah. They were very good to their family. Somebody once saw them kicking a goat.
No.
And that was a character flaw. It was if you really believe in this and you believe in God, you would never do that to one of God's creation, right? So obviously we all screw up, we make mistakes, we get angry. But it was sort of like a slight little hiccup. So that this person was noticed, or if somebody, was seen to get angry or something like that. These were sort of little moral flaws that are in these biographies to help us say, are these strong stories, weak stories? So if there's a weak link in the chain, then that becomes sort of an okay story. If there's multiple weak links, it becomes a weak story. And so these become really important, these compilations, because the Quran is the speech of God sent to the Prophet Muhammad through Angel Gabriel, as we said, in precise meaning and wording. Muhammad doesn't have any say in what is the Quran's text. He's just a transmitter, simply said. And then there's modern linguists that have sort of looked at the Hadith collection and the Quran collection, and from a linguistic point of view, what they've said, not that we know whether this is God's word or not, but the Quran and the Hadith are different authors. They have different modes of speech, and that the Quran speech is consistent through itself, whereas Hadith speech seems to have a couple different voices. So that's interesting to share. It's something that Muslims would say that makes sense to us. That linguistically, that seems how it goes across. And then the Quran is sort of unchanged from when the Prophet recited it. And so it's understood that spiritually that the Quran talks about, God says that He will protect this text from change or adjustment or corruption. And that's not with the Hadith collection. So the Hadiths, as I said, means news, report, narration, something like that. Here it's something specifically about the Prophet Muhammad. And it's something that he said, something that he did, or something that he approved of by sort of not objecting to it. So if he saw somebody praying in a certain way, like there are different ways that Muslims pray. Sometimes you'll see people hands like this when they're standing. Sometimes it's here, sometimes it's here. You would think it's not a big deal, but people get up in arms, no pun intended, about those types of things. And so if the Prophet saw somebody praying like this and he didn't say anything, that means that's acceptable. And these things help because as detailed as the Quran can be, there's always room for interpretation and understanding. And the first interpreter of the Quran is the Quran itself. There's places where it self-references. The number two interpreter of the Quran is the Prophet Muhammad. Right? So how did he implement a particular verse? What did it mean? How much leeway is there? How much understanding is there? So one of the good examples is, for me at least, because it's a pretty jarring example, most of the Quran is about guidance. It's about spirituality. It's about a connection to God. It's about moral action, things like that. There's about, I should bring a pie chart for the next time. It's about, I want to say like 10 or 12% of it is like do's and don'ts. Legally, types of do's and don'ts. And so one of them is obviously like stealing, right? There's stealing. And there are specific punishments for stealing. Now the Prophet Muhammad, lots of times he didn't implement those punishments. So that provides understanding of, okay, there's this verse that says if you steal, you have this punishment, but that punishment can be met out in different ways, right? There's a holistic understanding. So one of the things to understand is, like there was a time of essentially a recession or depression, an economic tough time. Food was scarce, and somebody was caught stealing food, right? And they were not given any type of punishment because they were doing something out of desperation. That was not. So he is telling us by not implementing it, that is not the purpose that this verse is to be instituted for. There's a higher understanding of what justice is. This person is not stealing with intent to steal in a malicious way. They're doing it out of like a biological hunger thing. So as we go through our study, we'll talk about these things because sometimes I'll reference hadith that will help explain something either that's ambiguous or something that seems really cut and dry, but is less cut and dry than it seems at first glance.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What do the letters PDUH mean after?
So there's different ways. So there's a tradition, a strong tradition, that the prophet, all prophets, it's a heavy burden, and it's a gift of what they bestow to us. And so in recognition for that, to bestow and say good words to them when you mention their name. So Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Sometimes you'll see it SAW, and that's the Arabic transliteration, because when Muslims would say it, they'll say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, which the translation of that is peace be upon him. And they'll use those terminologies. Muslims will use that when referring to Abraham or Moses, any of those sort of exalted figures in history. So again, to sort of highlight Sunnah, that's God practices of the Prophet, and those practices are sort of transmitted in Hadith, these sort of reported stories. Sometimes Muslims sort of intertwine these terms. You guys probably will know better than some people now that these terms are slightly nuancedly different, but they do sort of interact in a similar way. So, any questions or thoughts about generally about the Quran and the Hadith?
Is the Hadith then more the difference then between Sunni and Sharia, how they interpret it? Is that, or is it more complex than that? Is that one of their starts of
That's a
division?
that's a piece of it. Sunnis and Shias actually have separate collections that they refer to of the Prophet's actions. So they don't even, they tend not to have common texts that they refer to. The Quran is common, but these hadiths are different. So like, I am Sunni, I grew up Sunni, I've become much more appreciative of the Shia tradition. I didn't even know that there were other hadith texts other than the 6 growing up. Like, it was, that experience was so separated and different, right? Which I think is unfortunate. And so on campus, I try to, in my sermons, I'll like cite both as much as I can to give my students who are mostly Sunni at least a flavor of like, you should be aware that the other 20% of Muslims that you may not have a whole lot of interaction with have these understandings, have these texts, know these scholars, particularly being in the majority, to be a little bit more aware of what the 20% of Muslims who are Shia understand. But yeah, it's...
Could you give us a really succinct definition of the difference between the Sunnis and the Shias? I know it's probably a...
Yeah, so so when the Prophet Muhammad passed away, there's a disagreement on how leadership of the community should be decided. Some people thought it should be sort of a council of elders sort of selects the next person in charge. And the people who think that becomes the Sunni group. They didn't label themselves as such at that time. Those names sort of percolated over the first 1 or 2 centuries. But additionally, there's an understanding that political leadership of the community and spiritual leadership of the community can be potentially separated. Those who thought that leadership of the community should remain in the family of the Prophet Muhammad, that the family had a special status, a special knowledge, thought that it should go to his cousin, Ali. And Ali is really respected in Sunni sources, but he's even a higher level of respect, I would say, in Shia sources. And Ali should be the political and spiritual leader and authority. He becomes the 4th caliph. So there were 3 that Shia scholars and Shia would disagree with. and then the fourth was Ali, and then he passed away, and then after that, most Muslims would agree, after that it was just the age of like kings and empires. Like, you had a pious king every once in a while, but for the most part they're not spiritual leaders anymore. There's some theological differences that come from that too. So I wouldn't say it's just a political disagreement, it's more than that, because there's spiritual and theological concepts that spring from that, but that's sort of like a mini history. Yeah. So I'll go into the structure of the Quran really quickly. We'll just do an example. So we talked about the Quran has surahs or chapters, ayahs or verses, and then within those surahs, there's some structure. And I wanted to share a little bit of time on this because as we start reading into the text of the Quran in the English, I was confused. It can be very challenging to follow. It's not as we've talked about, it's not chronological. Stories, you might be reading something about Moses, and then it'll be something about inheritance law, and then there'll be a story about Joseph, and you're like, what happened? There's some thematic understandings that link it through, but it takes sort of guided study to appreciate that. So if you read it just straight out on your own, and a lot of times when you read like European academics who read the Quran in translation in like 17, 18, 19, even in the 20th century, 1900s and the 20th century, this is an incoherent text. Like, this is, Babylon book, and it's because it is a challenging read because without understanding the themes and not reading in the Arabic is a huge sort of shortcoming. But this is chapter 2. It's the largest chapter. It has 286 verses. And there's a sort of ring structure theory. Now, the Prophet Muhammad didn't mention this. This is like 20th century, 21st century scholars have argued that this is a way to understand coherence and structure in the Quran, and in particular in chapter 2. Because chapter 2 is long and has a lot of stuff in it. So it starts with just core about faith, belief, and unbelief. Chapter 1 starts with saying chapter 2, sorry, starts with the Quran is a clear text, and that it makes a description of what a believer is. A believer, like what kind of behaviors does a believer engage in, and then what kind of behaviors does a non-believer in God take part in. Then there's some early stories about God's creation. There's little snippets of Adam and Eve. Then there's stories about Moses bringing law. And then there's the story of Abraham and Ishmael. Right? And so there's a story of being tested. So the theme is faith, unbelief, about God's creation, about law coming down, and then about being tested. And then there's like a pivotal section in the middle that talks about how to compete in good works and how do you handle tests of faith. And then it goes back, and now there was, being tested. Now there's stories about Muslims being tested. There's stories about the Prophet Muhammad delivering law. There's talk about how to act in God's creation, and then it finishes with some really powerful verses about belief and unbelief. So Muslim scholars are starting to sort of apply this to other chapters, particularly the longer ones, to find pieces of it that they can understand. I think this, when I've talked to really classically trained scholars, they're like, I don't understand what the purpose of this is. But it helps those of us, I think, particularly in the modern world, who need a pie chart, who need a slide presentation to help us understand these things a little bit better. So we'll conclude with some translations of the Quran and talking about them. So we're not going to be reading the Quran in the Arabic. So if Muslims believe that it's God's speech, it's in Arabic, which not only is it a different language, it's a different language family, right? English and German have some relation. English, German, French have some relation. English, German, and Hindi and Bengali, like where my families actually have some relation. So if you guys study languages, there's this thing called the Indo-European language group. And so one branch of it goes to Europe, another branch goes to basically what's today India. Or even Farsi, the Iranian languages. There'll be some words that you'll find in common, there'll be some sort of grammatical structure things that you'll find in common. Arabic is Semitic. It's very different, right? Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic and Syriac, these languages have overlap and interesting, they're cousins of each other. But I'm guessing most of us in here don't have much familiarity with Hebrew, Syriac, Aramaic, and so Arabic. We're going to be translating from a language that is very different, right? Structurally very different. It's got speech, and then lastly, we talked about a couple times, it's written in verse. So those of you who know another language, even let's say it's Spanish, which is like a closer cousin of English, can you imagine translating Spanish poetry to English? Like how difficult, how much you lose, right? So translating verse, translating across languages, translating what Muslims would consider God's speech. Some would say it's a fool's errand, but we have to try to have some comprehension of it. And through the late 20th century, there was probably a handful, maybe 2 handfuls of English translations. The most popular one was one by a guy named Yusuf Ali. And that's a lot of Muslims have that in their house. And it uses sort of King Jamesy English. There's a lot of these, thous, yea, things like that. There's also some English 19th century, early 20th century translations. A guy named Arbery. And so those are okay translations. I see less and less Muslims using those nowadays. Muslims in America tend to use translations like this. So the Study Quran came out, I guess almost 10 years ago, I think 8, 9 years ago. It's a really good text. It was put together by a team of Muslim scholars, Muslim American scholars, under the direction of a guy named Syed Hossein Nasr, who is a professor of Islam at GW, about 90 years old now. His team was all his graduate students that have gone on to become professors and things. You don't need to read it, but you can see there's something here and then there's something here. That's the text, that's the footnote. So the book is extensively footnoted. So hence Study Quran, right? It's all in English. This translation didn't have some translations will have English and then a parallel Arabic. I think for your purposes, that's not necessary. You're not going to really get anything out of the parallel on the side. For people who have some facility with the Arabic, it's nice to see that so they can go into the text. What's in the footnotes is not so much their commentary or thoughts. What they have done, and this is the real gem of this text, is they've gone through the classical commentary of the last 1400 years, and they've cherry-picked what they think is either popular or relevant, and translated those classical commentaries from Arabic, from Farsi, from Turkish, from wherever, and then put them here. So when you read a verse, you'll say, scholar so-and-so in 1400s wrote this about this, but there's also somebody from the 1890s who thought this. Another interpretation from Shia sources is this. Now you know. They don't really dictate something. So it's a really great text to study, and study Quran. The actual English translation it's a little King Jamesy, so Truly thy Lord outspreads and straightens provision for whomsoever he will. Verily of his servants he is aware seen. Right? So there's some majesty to it. But I'm not going to use this text with my students at Bryn Mawr and Villanova to read. Because they're going to be like, what was that? Like, I don't understand. So it's not a great readability text for modern English-speaking Americans. Right? But it's a really great reference text.
Are the references similar to the Mishnah in the Jewish tradition?
The commentary?
Yeah.
I think so. So yeah, the Quranic commentary is called tafsir. And so that is scholars who have attained a level of understanding are making interpretive insights, judgments, or sharing what, oh, my teacher said this, I'm going to share that, or I think this, or in my understanding I think this, things like that. And there's classical commentaries, there's contemporary commentaries. So, yeah. And those help. They don't sort of give you an answer, but they sort of help flush out, particularly the verses that are more ambiguous or more open to mystical interpretation or interpretations of what does that word mean, because that word has multiple meanings in the Arabic. Things like that. Right?
Okay.
So maybe it's a homonym or something like that. This is the text that I've read through with teachers of mine. This is the one that I usually would use. This is from Oxford. This is a guy named M.A.S. Abdul Halim. He's a professor of Islam at SOAS. That's at University School of Oriental and Asian Studies or something like that, or Arab Studies. And it's a much more readable Quran, right? The other thing he does, he adds paragraphs. There's no paragraphs in the Quran, but he has taken what he thinks are part of that ring, and he said, oh, these verses together sort of form a thought, and so I'll make them into a paragraph, and then that helps a little bit with understanding, right? So this is not the same verse, but it's just a sampling of how it reads. The gates of heaven will not be open to those who reject our revelations and arrogantly spurn them. Even if a thick rope were to pass through the eye of a needle, they would not enter the garden. So it's a very easy to read translation. So those are the two major ones that I would probably share. Nowadays you can find dozens more. Every few years somebody is coming up with a translation of the Quran. This one is also good. It's called The Gracious Quran. This one's going to run you like $50, $60. This one's like $40, $50. This one you can probably pick up for like 10 or 12. It's in paperback. As far as everybody, when they translate, we talked about the difficulty, right? So you lose something every time you translate. So somebody maybe tries to keep the majesty of the text, but they make some concessions in translations of particular words, right? You could do a word-by-word translation, and then you look at the sentence, and you're like, that's not really what the sentence meant. Then you can do a sentence translation, but you're taking some liberties with the words, and then you're finding out later that, like, oh, I'm translating the same word differently in different parts of the Quran. So everybody has a challenge. I wanted to share this one. This one isn't published yet, but there's a professor at Yale of Arabic, Shoukat Fulwa, who's attempting to hold to the rhyme scheme of the Quran. Right? So all the Quran, the translations I read, and most of the ones you find, do not rhyme. Right? So here I'll read a translation of chapter 1. This is a chapter Muslims will recite like 17 times a day. So it's very, very well known. Nearly all Muslims observe it, we know this. So a translation renders, in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, Praise belongs to God, Lord of the worlds, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, master of the day of judgment. It is you we worship, it is you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, those who incur no anger and who have not gone astray. Okay? Now, Dr. Thurwa, he translates the same verses as, in the name of God, ever compassionate, full of compassion, praise to the Lord of all creation, ever compassionate, full of compassion, sovereign of the day of determination. You alone we worship, from you alone do we seek alleviation. Guide us to the path of true direction, the path of those you favor, not those who earn your wrath, nor those you deviation. I'm okay, I like this verse, the way he translates it. Sometimes I've seen some of the translations, because he's trying to really hard stick to the verse, he's trying to find right. And sometimes it comes around a little nursery rhymes, you know, which takes away majesty sometimes. So it's a struggle, right? Everybody is trying to emphasize something. So what we'll finish on here is back to the movie, and I'll send you a clip. If you want, I'll send you the link. If you want to watch the whole movie on YouTube, it's like, whatever, 2 or 3 hours. You know how the epics run. So we talked about the first moment of revelation. This clip here talks about that. The Prophet Muhammad, he's 40 years old. He used to sort of go on spiritual retreats up into the mountains and sort of sit in a cave and meditate. And in one of those meditations, at the age of 40, is when this revelation starts. He's sort of sitting there, and Gabriel appears to him, which freaks him out. Gabriel grabs him and squeezes him and says, read or recite, something along those lines, Iqra. And the Prophet Muhammad's like, I don't read. And he's like, read. I don't know how to read. He said, grabs him a third time, and it's read in the name of your Lord. And then Gabriel recites for him the first pieces of scripture, which are now codified in the beginning of chapter 96. So this is a little clip about that. I want to give you the background to what was happening with Muhammad, because again, he's not depicted here.
Abu Talib! Catch your breath, Saeed.
Has Muhammad come down from Margiana yet? He's been out there 3 days.
No? No, we haven't seen him.
Khadija hoped he might have come to you on his way home.
And he's still up there.
3 days.
I'm afraid for him on a mountain, because I don't know what it means. Men see the world too well from a mountain. Sensitive drop of blood, who teaches man what he knows not. Read.
Okay, so that's those are the first verses of Revelation, and then we can start going through that. My plan is to sort of go as much as we know, the order of Revelation. So what came down first, came down second, things like that. And the reason for that is a lot of that content, that's sort of how people experienced it first. Right? Number two is it's very deep theological content. A lot of it comes near the end of the Quran as it is assembled today. And those verses are a little bit on the shorter side. And while they're deep content, I think they're easier to digest because it's not buried. The chapters near the end are sort of self-contained. There's a theme. So chapter 97 has a theme. Chapter 101 has a theme. When we get to chapters like 2, 3, 4, 5, there's like dozens of themes. It becomes a little bit challenging to read through. So for those reasons, the fact that that was the order of Revelation and that it might be easier for us to digest and focus on something, I'm going to kind of start with that. And so in some ways, we'll be sort of near the back of the book, the last like 30 pages or so, where we'll sort of explore around and then we'll see how people feel and then where we can go next after that. Any thoughts, questions?
Well, I'm very impressed with your presentation, I have to say that.
Thank you. So we should get that version.
So that is really up to you. Yeah, if you want a text of the Quran, this is a good one that everyone, like I said, everyone has its shortcomings. The other thing is you don't really have to even, if you want to access it, Quran.com, you're surprised, has, so let's look, actually we'll go to 96, which is what we'll look at next time. Okay, so you can do translation in English, and then there's like a dozen translations to choose from. And we can even set up, I don't know if we can do all of them, but we can do several of them. And you can see like one translation, indeed it is we who sent down this Quran on the night of glory. We sent it down with determination. We have sent down the Quran. So there's lots of translations. So if you want to not spend any money and sort of peruse through a bunch of translations, Quran.com works for that. Obviously, it's not so much a readable text. So there's that online resource. That's probably the best online resource. And then there's dozens of Qurans that you can choose to purchase. And this is probably the most accessible. If you end up finding it not to your taste, you're only out like $12. That's not as big an investment as some of the other ones can be.
You certainly put it in perspective for us.
Good.
We've been sorting through what words mean and the context of when they were written.
Yeah.
Is different from what it would sound like today.
Yeah. Yeah, the Arabic of the Quran is not the Arabic that is spoken in the marketplace in Cairo, or Yemen, or Damascus, or wherever. There's dialects, first of all, Moroccan, apparently, I'm not an expert on these, but apparently Moroccan Arabic is so different that people from Damascus are like, what are you saying? I have no idea what you're saying. Maybe it's like somebody from like Houston trying to understand somebody who's Cockney English. It's like, what did you say? But more so than the dialect and the things, there's classical Arabic, and then there's what's called modern standard Arabic. And so there is.
Is that like Latin and English?
I don't think it's quite as big a gap. I think maybe a better analogy is sort of like Shakespearean English and modern English.
Okay.
So people would understand it. Like, so this happens. So like, people go to study, let's say at Al-Azhar, that esteemed Islamic seminary in Cairo, and they're learning classical Arabic and scripture and whatever you learn in seminary, and then they go to the marketplace, especially if you're not a native speaker, right? If I go there, I've learned my Arabic, and then I walk around the marketplace and people are like, dude, what is with you? Why are you talking in that way? I understand what you're saying, but that's not how we ask for a bag of apples, You're saying it in a very flowery way.
Are there people that are memorizing? Are they memorizing the Arabic?
Yeah, they're memorizing the Arabic and they're memorizing it in classical Arabic. Yeah.
And there's
Not English.
Not English, no. I mean, people will who have a good facility between the two, they can sort of mentally give you rough translations on the fly, just like with any language. But yeah, I don't know of anybody that has memorized the entire text in any particular English translation. And again, Muslims would say that in translation, these are not the Quran. These are translations of the Quran. The Quran is only in the Arabic.
So if we were to read something between now and next week, where do we begin? Give us.
So I would say,
give us the reference.
I would say do chapter 1 and chapter 96.
Chapter 1 and chapter 96.
And I would say maybe the first half of chapter 96. It's not that 96 is that long, but those first 5 to 7 verses are pretty powerful, and we'll probably spend quite a bit of time on that.
Is chapter 96 one of the ones that's thought to have been one of the early revelations?
So chapter 96, the first, I think 5 or 7 verses are the first revelations.
Okay.
That's what was depicted
So
here.
people agree about that.
Yeah, they agree on which ones were first. And then there's rough agreement of the order of them after that. And then it gets to like, it was in the first half of his life or in the second half of his life, right? So they're called Makkah or Medina. So the community was in Mecca for the first 13 years, and then for the last 10 years it was in Medina. And so sometimes they can get characterized as Makkah verses or Medina verses. So yeah, everything we're going to be discussing will be Mecca verses. So it will be pretty intense verses in translation, because they're trying to the verses are trying to shake people out of their idolatry. Right? There's going to be very stark things about that there's no power there, but what happens to people who don't follow guidance when it's given. Vivid descriptions of the end times, of Judgment Day. So it's some pretty vivid, powerful stuff. But I mentioned that to Todd. He was like, "They'll love it."
Was the Ten Commandments part of pre-Quran?
Ten Commandments. So I'm sure that the Jewish tribes and probably the Christian communities were obviously knew of or aware of the Ten Commandments.
Well, they weren't just Jewish, but there's a whole series that have been around for centuries.
Well, there are some emanations that might be seen as kind of humanist, but the Ten Commandments are the Ten Commandments. Now, I mean, I would assume, you know, as Shekter was pointing out, if Medina, Mecca are on that trade route, it's going to be the same trade route that you would have Jewish merchants, Christian merchants traveling down, and that's how you're getting spread of commonalities. And so there might have been an awareness of something along the lines of Ten Commandments, but that doesn't necessarily mean one is indicative within the other traditions.
Will you get the info on the Korans and send it to us?
I
I was just going to Amazon. I could take a picture of it,
Yeah.
yes.
No, I can.
Yeah, I'll email.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Very much.